1943, Italian skies. When Captain Giuseppe Torretti scrambled his fighter to intercept what he thought was a formation of American heavy bombers, he discovered something that shattered everything Italian propaganda had told him about their soft enemy. A single-engine fighter plane so massive and powerful it dwarfed his own aircraft, climbing effortlessly to altitudes his war-torn squadron could never reach. This wasn't just any plane. This was the P-47 Thunderbolt, an American propeller monster that Italian pilots quickly learned was almost impossible to shoot down, no matter how many of their best aces they threw at it. But what Torretti discovered about American industrial might through these encounters would completely transform his understanding of who was really winning this war and why. October 1943. The Italian sky burned orange as Captain Giuseppe Torretti pulled on his leather flight helmet. His hands shook, but not from fear. He had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. Around him, the Foggia Air Base looked like a graveyard of broken dreams. Bomb craters dotted the runway. Twisted metal from destroyed hangars caught the morning light. The smell of smoke and oil hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Giuseppe walked past his ground crew chief, Marco, who was trying to fix their last working radio with wire and prayers. The mechanic's ribs showed through his torn shirt. His eyes had that hollow look of a man who had given up hope months ago. 3 Machi fighters sat on the tarmac, but only one could fly. The other 2 had been stripped for parts like vultures picking at bones. "Captain," Marco called out, his voice rough as sandpaper. "We have maybe enough fuel for 30 minutes. The engine oil is almost black. The radio works sometimes." He shrugged his thin shoulders. "Maybe today we get lucky." Giuseppe nodded and climbed into his cockpit. The leather seat was cracked and patched with tape. His instrument panel had 3 broken gauges. The Americans had been bombing Italian factories for months. No new parts came anymore. No new planes. No new pilots to replace the ones who never came back. The radio crackled to life with static and panic. "All fighters scramble!" Large formation of American bombers heading toward Rome. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Rossi, barely 19 years old, trying to sound brave. Giuseppe had trained him just last month after his instructor died in a training accident. They had no fuel for proper training anymore. Giuseppe fired up his engine. The Daimler-Benz roared to life, but it sounded rough and tired. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. He taxied down the broken runway, dodging holes big enough to swallow his landing gear. Behind him, 2 other fighters struggled to start their engines. One coughed and died. The pilot hit the side of his cockpit in anger. As Giuseppe climbed into the thin morning air, he looked down at his homeland. Italian cities lay in ruins. Trains sat motionless on bombed tracks. Factories stood silent and dark. His own village had no electricity for 6 months. His wife wrote letters about eating grass soup and trading wedding jewelry for bread. The radio crackled again. Target approaching from the south. High altitude. Very high. Giuseppe pushed his throttle forward and began to climb. At 15,000 feet, his engine began to strain. At 20,000, it wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. At 25,000 feet, he saw something that made his blood freeze. It was not a formation of bombers. It was one airplane. One single fighter plane. But it was bigger than anything Giuseppe had ever seen in the sky. And it was still climbing. Giuseppe stared at the monster in the sky above him. The American fighter looked like a flying barn with wings. Its engine was twice the size of his own. While his Machi wheezed and struggled at 28,000 feet, the giant plane climbed away like it was going for a Sunday drive. Giuseppe's hands went numb from the cold. His oxygen mask frosted over. The American pilot probably sat in a heated cockpit, comfortable as a man reading his newspaper. Over the next 3 weeks, Giuseppe saw more of these flying monsters. They appeared everywhere across Italy, destroying bridges, trains, and fuel dumps. Italian pilots called them Jabos, fighter bombers that hit like lightning and disappeared into the clouds. Giuseppe watched helplessly as they tore apart supply convoys on the roads below. His own squadron lost 2 pilots, trying to catch just one of them. The intelligence reports made Giuseppe sick to his stomach. The Americans called their monster the P-47 Thunderbolt. It weighed 7 tons, more than some Italian bombers. Its engine made 2,000 horsepower. Giuseppe's plane made barely 1,000. The American pilot sat behind armor plating thicker than the walls of Giuseppe's childhood home. 8 machine guns stuck out from the wings like the fangs of a metal wolf. In the maintenance hangar, Giuseppe watched Marco and his crew work miracles with nothing. They pulled spark plugs from a crashed fighter to fix another plane. They mixed regular car oil with aviation fuel to make it last longer. They sewed patches on torn fabric wings using thread from old uniforms. 3 broken planes became 1 flying machine through pure Italian creativity and desperation. Then came the day that changed everything. Giuseppe finally got close enough to damage one of the American monsters. His bullets hit the P-47's wing and engine. Black smoke poured out. Giuseppe felt a moment of victory. But the American plane kept flying. It limped away toward Allied territory, trailing smoke but still in the air. Giuseppe's own plane had taken hits in the engine and was dying fast. Later that week, intelligence brought news that made Giuseppe's heart sink. A captured American pilot told his guards a story that seemed impossible. The young man, barely 22 years old, explained that his damaged P-47 had been his backup airplane. His regular plane was being serviced that morning. He flew the mission anyway because, as he put it, "We have plenty more where that came from." Giuseppe sat in the empty mess hall that night, staring at his thin soup and piece of stale bread. He thought about the American pilot's words, "Plenty more where that came from." Giuseppe's squadron had 12 planes when the war started. Now they had 3 that could fly. The Americans had shot down one of their fighters and treated it like losing pocket change. November 15th, 1943. Giuseppe finally got his chance. A lone P-47 flew lower than usual, probably damaged from an earlier fight. Giuseppe dove from above, using the sun to hide his approach. His bullets found their target. The American monster's engine coughed and died. Thick black smoke poured from the cowling. But victory came with a price. Giuseppe had used his last wingman as bait. Mario's plane spun into the ground in flames. Another friend dead. Another family destroyed. The P-47 crash-landed in a field near Bologna. Giuseppe circled overhead and watched the American pilot climb out of his cockpit, unhurt. The man looked so young, maybe 19 or 20, about the same age as Giuseppe's own son back home. Italian soldiers captured the pilot within an hour. They brought him to Giuseppe's base for questioning. Giuseppe stared at the young American through the fence of the prisoner compound. The boy's flight suit was thick as a winter coat. Giuseppe touched his own thin cotton uniform, worn through at the elbows. The American's boots looked brand new. Giuseppe's had holes stuffed with newspaper. Most shocking of all, the prisoner pulled out a chocolate bar from his survival kit and offered to share it with his guards. Giuseppe had not seen chocolate in 2 years. 53 missions, the American told the intelligence officer during questioning. Giuseppe listened from outside the tent. I volunteered for extra tours. My squadron gets new planes every month. Sometimes we get better ones than what we had before. The boy spoke about war like it was a job at a factory. No fear. No desperation. Just work that needed doing. That night, Giuseppe sat alone in his quarters and opened his diary. His hands shook as he wrote. We told ourselves we were fighting soft Americans who could not handle hardship. But this boy has flown more combat missions than our entire squadron combined. His airplane cost more than our entire air base. He carries chocolate bars in his emergency kit, while we fight over scraps of bread. Giuseppe put down his pen and stared out his window at the dark sky. For months, Italian newspapers had written about weak Americans who lived easy lives. They said Americans were too comfortable to fight real wars, but Giuseppe had seen their machines. He had fought their pilots. The truth hit him like a punch to the stomach. The Americans were not soft. They were rich. Rich enough to build 1,000 fighters every month. Rich enough to give every pilot a heated cockpit and thick armor. Rich enough to let young men volunteer for extra combat missions because they knew more planes were coming. Giuseppe picked up his pen again. I shot down their machine today, but I know they have 1,000 more waiting. We barely have fuel for tomorrow's mission. How do you fight an enemy that treats war like a business and has all the money in the world? May 1945. The war was over. Giuseppe walked through the ruins of his hometown near Naples, his worn boots crunching on broken glass and rubble. American bombs had flattened half the buildings. The other half stood like broken teeth against the sky. His own house had no roof. Rain had rotted the furniture inside. His wife Maria waited for him in the doorway, thin as a shadow, but alive. Their reunion was quiet. Too much had happened for big celebrations. Giuseppe carried only one bag from the war. Inside were his diary, a piece of metal from the P-47 he had shot down, and 3 photographs of dead friends. Everything else had been lost or stolen, but his mind carried something heavier than any suitcase. He had learned things about America that Italian newspapers had never printed, things that changed how he saw the world. Walking through town, Giuseppe saw American trucks bringing food and medicine to Italian families. The drivers were young men, maybe 20 years old, handing out chocolate bars to children like it was nothing special. Giuseppe remembered the American pilot he had captured. That boy had carried more chocolate in his emergency kit than Giuseppe's entire village had seen in 2 years. Giuseppe started working at the local school, teaching children about mathematics and science. But the real lessons came during lunch breaks, when he told them stories about the war. He never talked about the fighting or the killing. Instead, he talked about the machines he had seen and what they meant. The American fighter plane I shot down, he told his students one afternoon, weighed more than 10 small cars. Its engine was bigger than our entire classroom. The pilot told me his country built 1,000 of these planes every single month. Think about that number. 1,000 every month. The children stared with wide eyes. Giuseppe continued, They did not win the war because they were braver than us. They won because they built more machines than we could ever destroy. Years passed. Giuseppe's son came home from university in Rome, full of questions about democracy and freedom. Giuseppe sat with him on their rebuilt porch and shared the most important lesson the war had taught him. I learned more about America from the machine that nearly killed me than from all the propaganda we were fed, he said, watching the sunset paint the sky orange. Their strength did not come from harsh discipline or perfect soldiers. It came from free people, who could build whatever they needed to win. Giuseppe pulled out the piece of metal from his old enemy's plane. This propeller monster taught me something our leaders never understood. True power comes from giving people the tools and freedom to create, not from forcing them to obey. When free people decide to build something, nothing can stop them. That is why we lost, and why Italy must learn to be free.